our next speaker, Arzu Merali. Is it working now? Oh, it's working there, but not there.
No panic.
So, I'd like to thank the organisers, first of all, for inviting me.
Microphone.
I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to be presenting about a project which colloquially is known as the Hate Crime Project that my organisation, the Islamic Human Rights Commission, launched about 4 years ago now. We're into our 5th year. And I'll be presenting some of the findings, some of them already published in this publication, France and Hated Society, Muslim Experiences, some of which are new.
Closer to the microphone because your voice will not travel.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Great.
Before I start the presentation, I just need to also acknowledge the other people who worked on this project. It's led by Saeed Reza Armani. I'm very privileged to be working with him. And the particular work that we've done on France was also done in conjunction with myself and Ehsan Shahbasmi with support from Mohammed Saeed Bushra. Other people who've inputted onto this project are Mohsen Apoui, and my paper will also deal with some substantive work on minority rights, which was largely undertaken by myself and some people Karen Linder. So my paper is called The Mark of Muslim, the Law of the Citizen and Islamophobia in France, and actually I want to speak to some of your findings, actually, some of which I think probably tally and some of which we can have a discussion on later, because I think there's some interesting divergence. In order to kind of analyse the data and present to you specific findings that relate to the idea of the Muslim in France as a subject of French law, and therefore also as a citizen, whether they technically are a citizen or not. This paper, or this presentation, is going to be split into several sections, some of which I'm probably going to have to shoot over very quickly or even omit altogether. So, as I mentioned, this is we undertook a survey approach to assessing Muslim experiences of hatred in various national settings. From the pilot project of this, which was undertaken in 2010, in the United Kingdom and in France, we developed a model, or say, in particular developed a model for the domination hate model of intercultural relations. So in order to discuss the Muslim experience in the French context and what this means for Muslims as subjects of the law and as citizens, we need to discuss the idea of the casting out of Muslims from the law. We need to look at the background of the actual project, why we set it up. A quick overview of the theoretical framework of DHMIR. What does it actually mean? How does it break down what the concepts that underpin it? What the findings were vis-a-vis citizenship and the law. And then I will try and make some connection with where the current debates actually sit around issues of minority rights in the realm of sort of legal scholarship and mainstream human rights discourse. So, with regard to casting out, this paper starts on the sort of assumption that we understand that there are implicit and explicit minority rights conventions and other instruments which France, amongst other countries, have signed up to, like the Framework Convention on National Minorities, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and that these actually carry within them the idea that law and policy at a structural level will exclude minorities by virtue of the enactment of different norms, the norms of the majority. Okay, and this, whether it's intentional or unintentional, will target minorities by enacting such difference. And as a result, various different correctives are suggested and discussed and debated amongst all of these contentions. Now, all of those provisos are formed from the notion that minorities are not to blame for their situation of marginalisation. Okay, and that not only must they be protected and allowed to express their identity, but they have to be protected from the vagaries of the dominant group. When I say this, oftentimes people go, what are you talking about? These are actually fairly well established conversations going on when it comes to minority rights, human rights, the development of law in very specific circles. Clearly, this is very distinct from many national political debates within which legal structures and media production become entangled, and they all mutually constitute itself into a very polarizing debate. Now, that particular space, that polarized space, okay, is the one that Muslims are cast out from particularly with regard to law and politics. Myself and Armani have described this space as a space lacking of the substance of liberal democratic promises that we are all supposed to be somehow availing ourselves of, and if we don't actually, or if we cannot find that promise, it's somehow because of a lack in us. Well, actually, our argument is that the space itself is lacking in that substance when it comes to minorities per se. Razak has said in post 9/11, European and North American settings in particular, Muslims have been cast out of this space deliberately by targeted policy of political, intellectual, and media rhetoric. There's not enough time to go into it, but there's actually even at the Consultatar some recognition about difference having to be acknowledged in the pursuit of true equality. Now, rather than having this debate, and it's a vigorous one, and there's all sorts of debates and contestations, and if there's time I'll come to at the end about what minority rights means, etc., etc. We have public policy and media and intellectual discourse, and there's quite a lot of discussion about how that plays out in France and here, that we argue is informed by Hall's idea of the guarantee being a projection of racial or ethnic or gender or other types of markers onto groups, okay, that essentially create difference, create barriers. The findings of this survey suggest something that we have coined as the Muslim guarantee. Okay? Now, this is something that essentially collapses the religious guarantee and the biological guarantee. These are sort of the operation of religious prejudices and prejudices predicated on biological racisms of old and new. And I think that speaks to some of what you were talking about earlier. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail later. The key findings of this project in general show that vis-a-vis experience of hatred, and I'll go into what those categories were a bit later, there's significant correlation between that and these variables. Gender, so women were more likely to have these experiences. Age, those who were very young and those who were older had a higher marked out experience. Work status, education, religiosity, and visible Muslimness. These had differing, it had differing impacts on different types of experience. Some of the findings are counterintuitive, but they're also a powerful critique of assumptions about Muslims in the public space. So we'll get to them vis-a-vis education in particular and gender in particular, but also religiosity and secularity. That divide is, in Razak's argument, and one that we've been heard with, the colour line that essentially divides and casts out Muslims. And the idea being, particularly in very aggressive public discourses, that if you abandon one and adopt the other, you will no longer have problems. You will be a citizen, and you will not only be fulfilled in yourself, but will have a reciprocal fulfillment from the state of your citizenship and rights and duties. So there we go. A further explanation from Razak of what that colour line, and it's also patriarchal oppression. She focuses, and we've heard a lot about it already, the tropes of gender versus the Western liberal enlightened citizenry. Now, as I mentioned, this project started in the UK and France, where we did a pilot project where we were essentially trialing the questionnaire and the methodology and trying to develop something sustainable, and I'll go into that in a minute. But we then refined the questionnaire and the methodology, and we ran it from the USA and Canada. And this is where we've seen divergence in the case of France. With regard to the UK, USA and Canada, we could see the operation of the religious guarantee. Muslims themselves felt marked out by their religion. So the more that they felt themselves to be visibly Muslim, or the more the higher their perceived levels of religiosity, their negative experiences increased. What we had in France was also an explicit racialization, but in a biological sense, not just the racialization through the process of targeting out Muslims with a religious identity instead of an ethnic one. So to give you an example, it's the most significant part of this, that when people were answering the demographic questions about their visibility at Muslims, so they were given options of hijab or beard, special clothing, not visible, or visible in another way. Just over 20% of the respondents ticked in another way, and then added phrases when we asked for description. I have black skin, I'm black, I'm black. So what we're finding is that both the idea of religion and race or ethnicity are collapsing into each other. There is a kind of ubiquitous experience of being Muslim which transcends those divides in the other countries. Another one of the anomalies, and we'll come to it, is the idea of religiosity. Again, as I just mentioned, higher in the other countries, it was completely correlating, whereas in France there were a lot of anomalies, particularly, for example, with those who consider themselves to be secular. And in fact, they had greater experiences of some forms of hate experience. And this, if you like, refers to the Fanonian concept of going unnoticed. The promise, or the promise of citizenship, is that if you throw off the markers that you self-impose that conflict with the secular ideal, then you can go unnoticed. There will no longer be, essentially, that targeting that you perceive or that is actually happening to you, or whatever it is that you're describing in a negative way. Well, as Fanon put it, he cannot go unnoticed. He is marked out by the way he does. So going on to why we actually developed this project. The Islamic Human Rights Commission, although I'm from the research department, and there's a crossover between that and other sections, we are also a campaign and advocacy organisation. And part of what we do, or have always done, we were set up in 1997, was to try and monitor hate crimes, particularly physical attacks, and also cases of discrimination, in order to have the necessary policy conversations with authorities, with the national government, regional governments, police, and so on and so forth. And we found there are many, many obstacles to having a kind of serious conversation. On the one hand, we were always being told that if you provide us with statistics, we can take your claims more seriously, and on the other hand, there was no support to collect statistics. There are a lot of deterring factors. Here are some: lack of trust in the police and authorities on the part of people reporting. And whilst our subject for our surveys are Muslims, I would stress that this methodology and the whole model is something that we think other outgroups can use or develop or work with. There is also a fear of double discrimination that's been well recorded, that is, people fearing reporting, even to third-party organisations, because then they fear another level of victimisation, whether it's from police or the people they manage or whoever. Or even just a kind of apathetic feeling that, well, nothing's going to happen anyway, so why bother? And interestingly, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France have also raised similar concerns, and that's their quote from their I think it's actually a 2011 report about 2010. There are additional problems: lack of governmental institutional resourcing. There simply just isn't money out there on a sustainable and substantial level to do this. Problems of sustainability are then things that we had to look at and address. And also academic rigor. I mean, IHRC or FAIR or CCRF or anyone can run around monitoring for 1 year on sort of the goodwill of people involved. But how much can you do if you cannot really afford to pay people to do this on a permanent basis? You cannot go around asking every Muslim if they've experienced something and people are not reporting. Therefore, you have a serious issue of underreporting. Some more issues around this that we decided to kind of tackle. One of the issues with regard to those statistics and the way they are presented currently with regard to other communities as well is actually inadvertently lending credence to this idea that we live in post-racial societies, so therefore hate crime statistics show you how many crazy people are out there attacking people on a hate-fueled basis, as opposed to looking at things somebody a bit earlier on a structural level. This is an issue of structural racism, that there is a connection between the two. We also had an issue around the fixing of arbitrary boundaries between sort of crime, discrimination, kind of emotional experiences in different settings and so on. And we wanted to kind of really take down those boundaries and see how to look at the situation in a holistic way. And we also wanted to tackle what was becoming clear, both in our our advocacy work, but in other survey work that had been coming up, and it's come up just now as I'm writing up the report on Canada, is the kind of internalization of the experience of abnormality, of being targeted, of being shouted at or whatever, by individual citizens of colour or minorities or outgroups, who would therefore then, when you ask them, have you experienced any form of hatred or discrimination, tick the box no, and then when you ask them, please give examples, they will say things like, well, apart from being spat at and shouted at on the street, no. So in fact, they did actually answer yes, but they had ticked the box no. And this is becoming an increasing problem. I think you can speed through that, but essentially, as trying to take on board all of these issues, this is why we tried to come up with this project. So going to the theoretical framework, there are 7 key concepts that underlie this. One is to assess what comes into being as a hate environment, and we propose to ask 3 questions, 3 other questions, to do with discrimination on the basis of religion, discrimination in educational settings. Failure to complain about this, and connected with society, so I'm really rushing through, but this paper will be available. Other concepts of the hated society, so the group that is essentially hated structurally, as well as the hating society. And I think it's important for us to say at this point that one of the outcomes of this methodology, or this theoretical framework over the course of the reports, is that we come to the conclusion that without wanting to underplay the seriousness of attacks and things that happen, that even those individuals who actually get up and feel incited to attack other people, in a way are also victims of the hate environment, because they are essentially incited by structural forces to make them do this. You know, oftentimes you'll even find people who, I hate to use the word, seem quite normal, being so aggravated that they will attack someone and will say afterwards, I don't know what got into me. But what you'll find is that they have been suffering essentially a kind of a layered exposure to negativity that just makes them brave. Okay, hate policy, so obviously the operation of law or things to do with institutions and so on. And again, another set of questions. These do not exactly correspond to the results you'll see later. This is the refined version that we're using currently. Hate representation. Now, obviously, this means media, this means to a certain extent political discourse as well, but we also wanted to look at kind of discursive racisms and actually even academia. There's a whole sort of analysis of that separately elsewhere. And we used questions to look at intercultural sensitivity and cross-cultural schemata, which is going to take a bit of a while to explain, so I think I'll shoot through it. But you'll see from the questions what we're kind of referring to there. This is actually Bennett's model of intercultural sensitivity, and kind of we found it a useful way to look at the progression we kind of achieve by unpacking this. The questions here: those who discriminate against us have an authentic picture about us and our religion. Those who discriminate against us are highly driven by media content. I think if people know more about us, they would act much better than the way they do now. Just two key points about the hated society, which I referred to before, which we assess by understanding people's feelings of how they were treated, as well as their experiences of things like physical attack and so on. The hated society is essentially a muted group, and it's excluded from self-representation, so looking at crime and other work that Arnold has done about how minorities are, essentially, initially it was actually with regard to gender, but then developed in terms of minority theory. Who cannot have access to the language of power, who are so completely excluded from it that even when they talk to power, they have to change the way they talk about their own issues to suit that, as opposed to how they talk to each other. So these are the 7 experiences from which we assess levels of feeling as a member of a hated society. Being stared at, physical assault, etc., etc. Okay, so to some of the findings, so most of the respondents under the age of 34, 69%, I thought that was uncannily representative. With gender, more women than men responded to this questionnaire. Place of birth, 68% France. So the rest of the countries, 98.3% said they resided and lived in France. 80.7% French citizens. Done that. With regard to ethnicity, this is something that will be refined in a later questionnaire, but you get a sense of ethnic origin, if you like. It's not something that we'll be going into probably in this same format for the next, and we're hoping to rerun this in 2015. We look to probably surveys like yourself to look for better classifications. Done that. Okay, visible Muslimness, and as I mentioned, this had significance. 50.4% hijab, 15.6% obviously male had beard, 2% special clothes, and I think, as I mentioned before, there was 20.2% who were visible in another way, gave ethnic markers. Less than half, just over half lived in neighbourhoods which were less than half Muslim, and about a third Muslim majority neighbourhoods. These become important later, which is why I'm raising it now. Income, I think, from what we could see, the income level of our survey was somewhat higher than the general demographic in France, so that's important to note. So later you'll see where there's difference and divergence. Similarly for employment. The majority of respondents reported that they were practicing, so again, religiosity comes into play later as vis-a-vis secularity. Okay, I don't know whether this shows really. No. 20, oh, yeah. Okay, well, anyway, we had 29 questions, which we asked people the frequency of experience that people had these. And I'll pick up on just a few key ones later, but also correlations with the demographic and mediation variables. Okay, so effective education. Being treated with suspicion or wrongly accused, others reacting as if they're intimidated or afraid, being insulted or harassed, not being taken seriously, being physically avoided, experiencing verbal abuse, experience of physical assault, being told you're oversensitive or paranoid about racism. All of these correlate to level of education. So, and you have to look at this carefully because the less education you have, the higher the rate of experience you have. So nominally there might be an idea that education gives you social mobility or a way to leave problems. But when you actually look at the level of frequency and you're looking at people who've been highly educated, you see that people who have a degree are experiencing at the level of 1 in 4 being told that they're paranoid or oversensitive about racism at least once a month. Okay, and 63.4% of them were experiencing it in some form across a year, whether it was once a year or more than twice a week. And then, if you put that in context, you're starting with your lowest, your lowest level of experience, very high, and then it gets much, much higher the lower the level of education. So vocational education and elementary school experience had figures in the high 70s. Overall, 61.6% of the sample said that they'd been told they were paranoid or oversensitive about racism. Which one is this? So again, education and being insulted or harassed, 51.4%. You can see the figures. Okay, level of education and physical assault. Yes, again, the higher level of education, the less likely you've been to experience physical assault, and we'll come to the issues around physical assault later. It ran at 11% across the whole survey of people having experienced something like that the previous year. Okay, gender, I should say education was the one variable that had a lot of impact on the results, but again, to emphasize that the starting level at what was the lowest was actually very high. With regard to gender, 2 minutes, oh my gosh, okay. All right, well, you can see that women had a greater experience than men. There's another table, there's another table. Okay. The 3 experiences which it was very impactful were being condescended to. There were 2 questions that related to that, and the other one was actually being, people reacting as if they were scared. And there's clearly a contradiction between the 2 here, but they are the reflection of 2 separate demonized narratives. And I think that's interesting in that you have both people being scared of you and at the same time treating you on the same daily experience, treating you as if you were basically inferior. And not feeling scared to treat you like that. Okay. Effective religiosity. Okay. As I said, in the French experience, these 3, I think it is, were where religiosity had an impact. But generally, there was a kind of ubiquity of hate experience. It wasn't really something that could be divided between a religious and secular divide. People felt that they were being attacked for being Muslim or experiencing hate experiences because they were Muslim, regardless of whether they were secular or religious. They were essentially marked as Muslims regardless. Visible Muslimness, very high experiences of verbal abuse in particular. So 84.4% of women who wear hijab said they've had such experiences, etc., etc. I need to just skip through these because I need to make a little bit of avert to the issue about minority rights. Sorry, with regard to qualitative responses, and we had about 130, I think it's very interesting to note that gender was impactful again. And this is actually the only country of the 4 countries that we've had response. About 10% of women said that they were threatened to be raped. And about 60% overall. So actually, you know what, I think I'm projecting that it's women, but 10% of respondents said that they've been threatened with rape, and 60% verbally abused. These are some of the things that people recounted that were said to them, or that had happened to them. Economic status was impactful in a couple of things. Young people under the age of 18 had a very high experience of hearing culturally and racially offensive remarks, and obviously it requires further research, but we need to look at how that works in a school setting. Okay. So what we are contending is that kind of conversation I was talking about before with regard to minority rights and what those discussions are, there has to be a way of making a connect between the latent potentiality of the law, and there in fact, despite all the negative things we've talked about France, examples in French law and policy where there is a recognition of difference. You have things like the aggravated offences with regard to hatred in the penal code, and things like this where we need to be kind of extracting that potentiality and connecting the debate that's going on about minority rights with the actual law of the country. I totally realise that there's not going to be a lot of purchase for the idea of rights for minorities as groups in France, but that is not to dismiss the whole debate, because there are liberal arguments, there are individualist arguments about minority rights that can all be instructive. To conclude, it's 30 seconds if I have done my conclusion. The research here, and it was a relatively small sample because it was a pilot project, and it was also very concentrated in one area. I've averted the kind of things that we found significant. They do provide a serious critique. The findings are not only counterintuitive in the sense of what you would generally expect or what we found in other projects, but actually speak directly to a kind of demonised narrative that I think has been well established by many people. The only way really beyond this kind of impasse is to look at those examples, and we've been very critical of them. You have to excuse me, I don't know how to pronounce it, the HALDE, the National Anti-Discrimination Institution, about how issues around gender, Muslim women, etc. have been left out. We need to make that connection, and really, without substantially incorporating not just a discrete body of rights and law and practice that protect minorities as minorities, but also without really incorporating the idea of a minority individual subject of the law, then we can't really progress beyond this impasse. It's really that urgent, and we understand this as we finish. And it seems a sad thing to say, but we are predicating this on the basis that we assume that government and given authority actually would like to see one day of space without any type of violence of the sort. Thank you.